So we did see that depending on which book you're using and which version, this Mishnah may be one Mishnah or two Mishnahs. It may be in one order or in a different order. So we're sticking with the version that this is part 2 of Mishnah 21. Okay, so Pirkei, chapter 5, Mishnah 21. But before we start this piece today, we still have one little piece left from last week that I just wanted to share something about, which is quite interesting. So last week we spoke about Ben Bagbag, who says that you should learn Torah again and again, hafachba v'hafachba, churn it and chew it over and chew it over. Why? The kulaba, because everything is in it. Now that's not such a surprise to us that everything is in the Torah. It's not a surprise. Hashem looked, Hashem looked into the world, and that's how he created the Torah. So you expect that everything will be in the Torah, and in fact, we actually even have stories, some really interesting stories about people and life stories and things that happened to them, and then there was clear indication in the Torah. I'm not going to go down that whole story of people who do Torah codes and stuff like that, because I'm not sure that that's exactly what it's talking about. We can debate, the veracity of the whole Torah code concept, or if that's even something that we should be focused on. But I do want to share something else which is really interesting, just to help us understand this concept. What does it mean that everything is in the Torah? It's not only that you could look into the Torah and you'll find information, and that information is going to be useful. For example, I'll give you an example. So some years ago, a man came running into the study of one of the Chabad Rebbes, and he was so excited. He said, they've just made the scientific breakthrough, and it's going to make a huge difference to us, because we're people who learn Torah all day. So it's going to make a huge difference to us. This is the secret of concentration and memory. The guy was so excited about it. What did they discover? They discovered that there's some kind of a nerve or something in the back of a person's neck. And again, when I say nerve, this is a translation, so it may not be exactly accurate. But basically, the way that it works is if a person tilts their head forward, it helps to focus. So that's the best way to learn, to take in information, is to actually lower your head, So you often see people thinking like this. And if you want to recall information, you want to remember something, you throw your head back. And that helps you to recall information. This guy was so excited about the fact that science had discovered this thing, and he needed to tell the Rebbe immediately. But the Rebbe didn't react. Instead, he went over to the bookshelf, pulled out a book, and he flipped pages till this book, which was a few hundred years old, and there it said clearly that if a person wants to concentrate, you should tilt your head forward. And if you want to remember, you tilt your head back. But there's another layer to this. It's not just simply that the Torah is the template for the world and therefore all the information is in the Torah. Here's a very, very interesting principle. When we say kulaba, everything is within the Torah, you have to understand that's not just information. There's another layer to this completely. Here's how it works. And this is kind of the Jewish version of time travel. Okay? So it's a really interesting concept. Before we get to that, let's just use an example we can all relate to, and that is the concept of the relativity of time in our own experience. For example, let's say that you have children who live overseas, and they're coming to visit. So the week of countdown until they come to visit is way longer than the week that they're visiting. Right? It's the relativity of time. So depending on the circumstances, time feels completely different. But there's another layer to relativity of time which the Torah speaks about, and that is where you are spiritually, time behaves differently. This is a really interesting concept. So where you are spiritually, time behaves differently. So for example, we talk about the fact that there are 4 spiritual dimensions in the creation. We call them in the language of Kabbalah, Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya, 4 different worlds. We're in the world called Asiya. In our world of Asiya, it takes a certain amount of time to achieve certain things. So for example, it takes a person, let's say roughly 20 years, maybe 25 years, to reach physical maturity. And that includes the brain, right? Physical body maturity might be earlier, but the full brain maturity, you got to go to, basically till your mid-20s. When Hashem made Adam, he was a fully mature adult at 1 minute. So there's this relativity of time. In our reality, it takes a certain amount of time in order to achieve certain things. So they tell a story, for example, that the Arizal, and this is really interesting, you know how everybody tells you, in fact, somebody made a big deal about it this Shabbos in our shul, everybody tells you about how important it is to take a nap on Shabbos. Shina b'Shabbos tainug, that it's a pleasure, part of the pleasure of Shabbos to take a nap. But what people don't know necessarily is in the mystical tradition, all the great Kabbalists, they used to take a nap on Friday afternoon. Did you know that? Let's take a nap on a Friday afternoon. The reason for that is because in spiritual terms, Friday afternoon is the time where the Shekhinah, so to speak, takes a nap. So they would align with that. It's not that they took a nap because that's how things are in the spiritual realms. It's because that's how things were in the spiritual realms. It affected them that they dozed off at that time. So on one occasion, the students of the Arizal noticed that the Arizal had dozed off, but he was incredibly unsettled while he was resting. And they were curious, like, what's going on? So when he woke up, they understood it wasn't like he was having a nightmare or he was just anxious, and they realized something was going on. So when he woke up and he had slept for whatever period of time it was maybe like half an hour or something like that. So when he woke up, they said, what was all that about? What did you just experience that was so turbulent, that was so tumultuous? So he said to them, if I were to explain to you what I've just experienced, it would take 15 years. 15 years. Now, the truth of the matter is that's not so far-fetched, because if you think about it, in our own dreams, time is warped. And we understand that the experiences of dreams don't necessarily follow the real normal time pattern. But in this case, you're talking about a person who's a great tzaddik. When a person's a great tzaddik, they're able to have some experience in the dream state, which is from a higher reality. And in a higher reality, you can encapsulate a whole lot of years of time in our world into a short period of time in that world. So you can kind of see, when we talk about something like Ruach HaKodesh, it's actually a person seeing a chunk of years in a small passage of time. It's like getting this fast forward of a passage of time. So let's use another dream that we've just read about in the last week's parasha, which is Yakov's dream of the ladder and the angels. And one of the interpretations of the dream is that those angels represent all the various empires that were going to persecute the Jewish people, and each step along the ladder represents a period of time that they were in control. So he's able to see the whole span of history. We don't know how long Yakov was sleeping for, but we know that he sees the whole span of thousands of years of history compressed into this unique period of time. And then we have another example which is even more profound than that, which is in Tehillim. Tehillim, what does it say? That we say, Elef shanim beinecha k'yom esmol, that for you, Hashem, 1,000 years of our time is like one day of your time. So that means that in the period of so-called 24 hours, it is possible to see or to experience or to compact 1,000 years of what will play out later in history. And then the highest level of them all is the expression that is used by the Kabbalists, that at the highest level, kulam niskorin biskira achas, everything is seen in a single glance. Everything, from top to bottom, every single detail of the entire world, every single event that will ever happen across the whole of history is seen in a single glimpse. So that's what Torah is. It's not just that all of the information is coded into the Torah and then we have to learn how to uncode or decode what's written in the Torah. It's one glance at the whole of everything, not only history, everything. The truth of everything is encapsulated within the Torah because the Torah is at such a high, advanced level of godliness. Therefore, by nature, it includes everything within it. So, the message to us is we've got to keep churning and analyzing and reanalyzing and researching and learning, because slowly we can unpack all that wisdom and all that insight, not only as a means, that's not why we learn Torah, to work out what the future holds, but certainly to understand how the world works. That is a really big part. So I didn't get to that last week, I just wanted to round that off. This week, we're going to talk about Ben Hey, who, according to some opinions, as we have seen, is the same person as Ben Bagbag, and both Bagbag and Hey are pseudonyms given for the same reason, because we're talking over here about an individual who was a ger, right? Ben Ger and Ben Giores, that he was the child of converts, or himself was a convert, depending on which particular view you go with. So what does he say? Something that every good from either parent or teacher has at some point told either their student or their child, which is Lefum Tzara Agra. No pain, no gain, as they say in today's world. But the direct translation of Lefum Tzara, relative to the pain, Agra is the reward. Now, let's pause for a moment and ask ourselves, how comfortable are we with that thought? Relative to the pain is the reward. Why doesn't it say relative to the effort is the, don't you think that would be a little bit more comfortable, right? Put in a lot of effort and you can anticipate you'll get a lot in response. Why pain? Okay, it's an interesting question. Why pain? And then, of course, we have to just kind of, refine the question a little bit further. What pain are we talking about? What are we suggesting over here? Are we some kind of a masochistic religion? Do we go out there and do things dafka to be in pain? There was a time in history where people did all these types of self-immolation and things to try and advance themselves spiritually. So people used to fast regularly. We don't do that much. I don't know, maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but I don't think we do, right? I don't think we have these regular fasts. We don't necessarily hear today about people who fast from Shabbos to Shabbos or who fast every Monday and Thursday or things like that. We certainly don't hear anymore of, in South Africa, nobody's going to roll in the snow. That was a thing that people often used to do in the Northern Hemisphere. They would roll in the snow to get that pain. I mean, you know how painful it is when you're exposed to that kind of cold. And that would be part of their spiritual development. So we can't do that over here. But we could do the other one that they used to do, which is go sit on a mound of termites, and just allow them to bite you. And, so we don't do those things. What kind of a pain? Where in Judaism do you see that there's some kind of celebration of pain or encouragement of pain? It doesn't really sound it doesn't sound very Jewish. So what do we mean over here when we say lefum tzara agra, that relative to the pain is the reward? It's interesting proposal. So let's try and understand what's going on over here. And we'll approach it possibly from a few different angles. The first one is the Gemara. The Gemara tells us, agra de pirka rihata, which means the same word, lefum tzara agra, so it's the same word. Agra de pirka, the reward for the perek. What would that mean? Are you ready for this? This is a great way to make half the crowd feel guilty, by the way. Right? Agra de pirka, the reward for the shiur. What's a shiur? Shiur is a measurement of time allocated to studying Torah. What's a perek? A measurement of content that is dedicated, that you learn. So that pirka is the same word as a shiur. Agra de pirka, the reward for the shiur. Rihata is running to get to the shiur. Right? That's where now interesting, you'd think that the reward is to come and to sit and to learn. That's what you'd expect. But actually the Gemara is saying it's that urging yourself to move quickly to get to the shiur, which is a little bit of tsar, it's a little bit uncomfortable. We all know that one of the most famous things, I don't know how it used to be in the old days, but for sure one of the most common issues that we deal with today is the 5 more minutes syndrome. And by the way, I'm not talking about 5 more minutes in the morning only, where a person pushes snooze on their alarm clock. I mean, there was no snooze on the rooster in the old days. And we say every morning, there was no, can you imagine, you tell the rooster to snooze. When it was time to get up, I assume that people got up. For that matter, they probably also went to sleep at a decent hour. But it's not only that, we don't only have the 5 more minutes or 2 more minutes, whatever, with regards to sleep. It's about everything that we're doing. So I know I should be going to the shiur. I just have to check one more of those really important WhatsApp messages that came about the updates of what's going on in Israel, because if I don't check it, who knows, maybe the whole thing will fall apart. So it's that attitude. So tsara, there's a certain discomfort. Tsara doesn't have to be physical pain. There's a certain discomfort that a person experiences when it's riyata. I'm running from the things that I'm engaged with instead to do what Hashem wants. I'm running to learn instead of just doing whatever's going to indulge me for another few minutes, etc. And then the Gemara continues, and here it gets even more interesting. Agra de kala. Anybody know what the kala is? Nothing to do with marriage, by the way. You know what it is? So they used to have, and there's still many communities that have it on a regular basis now, it was called Yarchei Kala, which means that there were certain times of the year where they would gather massive groups of people together in order to learn Torah together. So you had all these scattered yeshivas around in Bavel, and there were certain times everybody used to come together and they used to learn together. So Agra de Kala, what is the reward for attending the Kala, these great learning seminars? What would you think is the reward? You'd think it's, I don't know, unity. I mean, yesterday there was a beautiful learning program here. Yeah, well, in Linksfield yesterday, right? Hundreds and hundreds of Yidden getting together and learning. So what's the reward? You'd think the unity, the learning, the innovation, the sharing of ideas. What does the Gemara say? Agra de Kala duchka. The reward of being at the Kala, at the Yarchei Kala, is that you sit there when it's so cramped. That's the reward. The fact that the room is so cramped, that it's uncomfortable. It might be much easier to sit somewhere else where you're just with your little group of people who normally learns together. But now you got all these other people on top of each other. that is where the reward comes from. Lefum tzara agra. There you see the principle that to be in a state of discomfort actually accelerates or increases the reward that we get for the particular mitzvah that we're doing. So that's very, very interesting, especially in today's world, because in today's world, people prefer to have personal space. Yes, it's a big thing in today's world, personal space. And we prefer to do things in a way that is leisurely and comfortable at our own pace. So take, for example, what's the difference between sitting at home and watching a shiur online, or coming into a group setting where you sit with a whole lot of people and you learn Torah together? Besides the fact that we've already learned that there's an advantage to learning in a group, but here we're seeing that discomfort actually makes the learning more valuable. The comfort of sitting at home with our feet up and a steaming coffee, or I guess in this weather it would be a friezo, right? So you're sitting over there just taking passively the information that's coming online, while of course that's valuable, and of course you're learning, and of course it fulfills a mitzvah, doesn't come close. Lefum tzara agra. You've got to have that discomfort of getting in the car and coming here and finding parking, and then coming to sit, and who knows, maybe somebody's going to ask a question that's going to derail the whole conversation, and then I feel like I wasted my time, and why am I here, and the aircon's not working so well, and then so the lefum tzara agra, that's exactly what it's talking about. In other words, he's teaching us a fundamental principle about Judaism, which is it's not supposed to be a comfortable experience. That doesn't mean to say it has to be a painful experience. We're not looking to invite pain into our lives, but we shouldn't anticipate that it's always going to be comfortable, it's always going to be on our terms, that it's always going to be in a way that is smooth sailing. That's what he's telling us, the lefum tzara agra. We have some great examples of this. I'm sure if you look in our early history, look at the early people who formed the Jewish nation, their lives were not plain sailing. Right? Lefum tzara agra. What does Hashem say to Avraham Avinu? Now I know. Now I know that you're dedicated because you were willing to go through all of these incredible tests and eventually come to the ultimate test of the lot, which was the Akedah. So now I know that you're not in it for yourself. I know that it's not just this experience of building your own ego. This is that you're willing to be uncomfortable for what I want. So that's effectively the framing principle over here. Now the question is, does that now mean, this is a very important question, does that now mean if I have two mitzvahs to choose between, one is an easier and one is a more difficult mitzvah, should I now dafka choose the more difficult mitzvah? Okay? Because the lefum tzara agra. Let's just pause for a second. Of course, over the course of our lives, there are mitzvahs that we do that are easier and mitzvahs that are more difficult. For example, and I know it's still safe because we're before Hanukkah, so I can still make this reference, and it's going to be a leap year, so I'm definitely safe to make the reference. Preparing for Pesach. Right? So I know that, once Hanukkah has passed, I know that it can create all kinds of anxiety, but right now I think we're still safe. So the preparation for Pesach, it's part of Judaism, it's part of our mitzvah, it's part of what we do, right? It's definitely a mitzvah that has a little bit more tsar associated with them. Physically, it's quite a draining mitzvah to prepare for Pesach, both the cleaning and the cooking and the changing over and all these things, right? Whereas preparing, let's say, or celebrating Shavuos, much easier. What's the hard thing about having cheesecake? Most people can handle it, right? So we all acknowledge that there are certain mitzvahs that come easier and there are certain mitzvahs that are more challenging. This idea that Ben Hey is telling us over here, the lefum tzara agra, is not to suggest that the harder mitzvahs are more valuable than the easier mitzvahs, because we've already learned previously that we're not allowed to weigh up the value of one mitzvah versus another. That's anathema to Judaism. You've got to accept that every single mitzvah has absolute value. It's what Hashem wants. So we can't stop making that scale. However, when it comes to the debate, should I be doing a mitzvah that comes easily or a mitzvah that is more difficult, that's not so pashut. And we have a good example of this. What's the good example? The Torah tells us, Ki sir'eh chamor soin acha roivetz tachas masoi. What happens if you're walking down the road in those days and you see your enemy's donkey is struggling under its load, which nowadays is you're driving down whichever street it is in Glen Hazel, and your enemy, God forbid you have one, their car is stuck, they've got a flat tire, it's overheated, who knows what, right? So what are you supposed to do, says the Torah? Your natural response would be, I'm not getting involved. This person doesn't like me, they've made my life a misery, I'm not getting involved, right? Says the Torah, azoiv ta'azoiv imoy. No, you've got to take it on and go and help that person, which is going to be tsar. That's definitely going to be uncomfortable. There's no question about it. You know what the Rambam says? He says something fascinating. He says, if that scenario presents itself, then you dafka have to go and help that person because they're your enemy to overcome your Yetzer Hara. In other words, he says the Torah is teaching us a principle over here that when there is a mitzvah that is going to cause more tsar, it is going to be more difficult, that's the mitzvah I have to prioritize. Because not just lefum tzara agra, because I'm going to get greater reward for it, because it's clearly more of service of Hashem to do something which is unnatural and which is difficult and uncomfortable for me to do than to do something which is natural and comfortable. So that's quite a valuable perspective for us to keep, because we easily tend to gravitate towards those mitzvahs that we like. And we'll do many of them, and maybe we'll get a lot of accolades, and the community will love us because we're always involved in those mitzvahs. But the challenge is sometimes to get up and do the mitzvah that is incredibly difficult for us, that makes us really uncomfortable. And then, lefum tzara agra, that's when we get not real, again, agra over here doesn't mean the reward of next life, Hashem's going to look over and say, well, that one was really hard for you, so I'm going to give you a lot of points. But agra means it's a much more shifting, growth perspective or experience than if it was a mitzvah that just, so to speak, came easily. I'll tell you a lovely story about this. So in the Chabad tradition, the way it works is when a person goes to see the Rebbe, you, on occasion, would have the opportunity to go into what is called a yechidus, which is a one-on-one, personal opportunity to have a conversation with the Rebbe. And in the later years of our Rebbe, the time just didn't allow for that anymore, and that's when the Rebbe started to give out dollar bills for people for tzedakah. But in the earlier years, there was a guy who goes and he was the rabbi of a community, he had a very successful community, he was a very successful rabbi, and he comes to have this personal audience with the Rebbe. And in his conversation, he says to the Rebbe, there's one thing that bothers me about being this very successful communal rabbi. He says, I don't ever find the opportunity to study Torah at the level that I should be studying. I'm either preparing a shiur or replying to people's questions or whatever. I don't have the opportunity really to learn on a consistent basis at the level that I'm supposed to learn. So the Rebbe said to him, well, what you should do is, at the end of the day, when you've finished everything and you're ready to go to sleep, then you should sit down and you should start learning at a level that you are capable of learning. And then the Rebbe said to him, in the beginning you'll find it very difficult, but after a while it will get easier. So he comes out of this audience and he runs, and this particular rabbi runs into a very colorful Hasidic personality called Mendel Futterfass, who was a hero of the Russian Jewish underground under the communists. He spent about a decade in the gulags in Siberia. So Mendel sees this rabbi come out and he says, "Nu, what did the Rebbe tell you?" So he tells the whole story. He said, I had this dilemma about when am I supposed to learn, and the Rebbe said to me that I should learn at the end of the day, after I finish everything, late at night, and in the beginning it will be difficult, and after a while it will get easier. So Mendel says to him, so how did you understand what the Rebbe meant by in the beginning it will be difficult, and then it will get easier? So he said, well, I understood what the Rebbe was saying is the first few weeks will probably be really difficult because I'm going to have to push myself at a time that I'm really tired, and hopefully over time I'll become habituated and it will get easier. So he said, you totally misunderstood what the Rebbe was telling you. He was telling you the first hour or so will be difficult, and the hours after that will be easier. So there you go, lefum tzara agra. There you see it right in that story. If you can push through the pain, the difficulty, the discomfort in the beginning of a process, after that follows the agra. After that, the reward is in the process itself. It's not necessarily that the reward is going to come at some later point. And we know this from our own lives. I'm sure everyone is able to think of some example of some area in our own growth where in the beginning it was incredibly difficult to push through. It was quite painful. It was tsar. But then it became actually not just normal, but it became really rewarding because of that tsar. And I think that's really the message he's trying to teach us over here, that if we expect that things are going to be a click and a download, that's not really where rewarding life happens. There has to be some element of sacrifice. There has to be something that we're ready to do that takes us out of our comfort zone. So that's lefum tzara agra. That means that the tsar, the pain we're discussing up here, does not have to be physical pain. We're not into that. We're not going to suggest that somebody is holy because they experience physical pain, even if that's the pain, let's say, of fasting. That's not what it means. It means, let's say here, you want to know what's really painful? Here's something that's really painful. I remember hearing a story of a rabbi who interviewed for a shul. He wanted to get the position as the rabbi of the shul. So the committee sits him down and they interview him, and they really liked what they heard, and they said, we're willing to hire you, but we have one condition that has to be written into the contract. What's the condition? You will never begin a drosha with the words, in this week's parasha. Why not? Because for many people that's painful. Oh, the parasha again. You know, I bumped into a person about a week or so ago. He says to me, the particular rabbi that he learns with, because I asked him a question, I don't know how it came up in conversation, but I asked him a question that was related to the parasha of the week. He says, well, the rabbi that I learn with, every single year we go back to the beginning of the parasha, so I only know the beginning of every parasha. I don't know anything beyond that, right? So there is a certain pain and discomfort in going back to things that we've already learned. It's much more exciting and refreshing to learn things that are new, right? We all enjoy things. We like a little bit of something fresh, something innovative. To go back and to review what we've already learned can be quite painful. Now, if you have a look, the classical way that they used to learn in the time of the Gemara is they would review the same passage 100 times before they moved on to the next one. 100 times. We are having a panic attack if the rabbi repeats the same thing we heard last year. And they used to repeat the same passage 100 times before they went any further. Now there is a tsar in that. There's an intellectual discomfort because it's a twofold discomfort. Firstly, there's the discomfort of revisiting something that we believe we already know. So why do I have to learn this again? I know it. I've learned it. You know. But not only that, there's an intellectual discomfort when I now have to push myself to understand or discover something I don't already know in this passage. That's when a person comes out of a very involved shiur and they say, my brain hurts. Yes. That's the tsar we're talking about over here. We're not suggesting over here that tsar is physical pain and physical discomfort. That might have a value. But he's talking about Torah learning. He's following directly from Ben Bagbag, who said, Hafoch ba v'hafoch ba, keep learning and keep learning. He's saying that's going to become a painful process at some point. At some point you're going to turn around and say, but I know this already. How much more is there? And that's where he says, Lefum tsara agra, if a person is willing to push themselves and to feel that intellectual distress, that's when they'll really get to understand things. And I don't even think it's that far-fetched, because we probably all can relate to this in our own experience. We probably all have at least something in our lives that we've learned again and again and again and again and again. And eventually you reach the point where you say, wow, actually now I'm starting to understand it. Right? There's certain things, whether it be the parasha of the week, whether it's a particular sefer. When we were in yeshiva, there were teachers in the yeshiva who would have one particular section of Chassidus that they would learn again and again and again and again and again and again and again. And you wonder, like, how much more can you get out of this than you see when you try and experience it yourself? You see that's actually where the real reward lies. Not the reward as in a prize that you get, but the reward as in the depth that you get and the perspective that you get. So that's really what he's teaching us over here. Now it's not so surprising that this should come from a person who is a convert, because the process of conversion is a painful process. It's not an easy process. So he knew this from first-hand experience. He knew that in order to get the agra, in order to get the reward, the value of Judaism, of Yiddishkeit, he worked out from his own experience that you have to do things that are painful. You have to make sacrifices. You may have issues with family relationships, with social relationships. Things that used to be quite comfortable, you're no longer allowed to do. Things that you never had to do, you now have to do. So Ben Heihei is well positioned to give us the drosha about Lefum Tzara Agra, that pain is a catalyst for growth and reward, because that was his own experience. It's also the experience of somebody that we've just read about in the parasha this week, and that's why I'm going to share it, even though under ordinary circumstances maybe I wouldn't plug it into this Mishnah, but seeing as it was the parasha this week, let's have a look at it. So who had tsa'ar in this last week's parasha? Yakov, right? Yakov had a lot of pain and discomfort in this past parasha. So let's have a look at it. What happened to Yakov in the whole of Vayetze? Well, not the whole, because at the end of Vayetze he actually does quite well. But In the beginning of Vayetze, what happens to Yaakov? Where's the pain? What's going on in his life that causes him distress? So let's compile a list, because there'll be a few things. What are we going to say?
The deceit of
Okay, the deceit is not the first thing, 100%. So the deceit is a major part of it. So, and we're going to talk about it. It's a major part. The first part is he has to run away from home. He is literally a fugitive from his own family. That's a tremendous amount. Think about it. It's a tremendous amount of distress. Correct. So first he leaves home. That's number one. He's a fugitive. Then along the way, Esav sends Eliphaz after him to effectively assassinate him on the route. And he manages to negotiate this incredible deal, which is basically take everything and let me live, right? So he loses everything. Keep b'makli ovarti es hayardein hazeh. He says in this week's parasha, across the Jordan River, excuse me, just with a stick in my hand. That's it. He's destitute. So that's also tsar, obviously. There's tremendous pain in losing everything. Okay, then what happens next? Then you got the deceit, and the deceit happens in two arenas. Same person, but two arenas. The first is Lavan cheats him in his marriage, which, by the way, raises a lot of intriguing questions, don't you think? Like the morning he discovers that instead of marrying Rachel, he married Leah, you would expect Yaakov to go and ask for a refund, right? Say, this is halachically not binding. You marry somebody under false pretense, not binding. It's really interesting that Yakov says, you were a bad man, but I'm still going to stay married to Leah. Anyhow, subject for another conversation. So that's the first deceit, is that he has to deal with, minor issues, family issues, just marrying so to speak, the wrong person. But the longest lasting tsar is the tsar of working for Lavan. Right? Because number one, he works such incredibly long and hard hours. We see that. Yaakov at the end of the story says to Lavan, he says, I went through all the incredible heat and the cold, and I didn't even sleep at night because I was so busy looking after your flocks, right? He's got a lot of tsar going on in his life. What else is there? There's one other element of tsar that I don't think people necessarily think of, but when you actually contextualize it, for Yaakov, it's a really big deal. Can you think of anything else that would be really distressful for Yaakov?
Was it when he was accused of taking the idol?
Okay, so that's interesting, because he wasn't. You're right. He was accused of taking the idol. He of course felt that it was an unfair accusation. So you're right. That is an element of stress. Anything else? The what?
The animals. The animals actually, in a way, to see it was honest, but there was. Good. Exactly. So believe it or not, and people don't necessarily think about this, but one of the greatest causes of stress in Yaakov's life is that he has to act in a deceitful way. Because we're introduced to Yaakov originally as Ish Tom, person of integrity and sincerity. Yaakov is supposed to be the icon of Emes. Titein Emes LeYaakov. He's supposed to be the ultimate representation of integrity. Yet when it comes to Lavan, he tells Lavan right from the beginning, if you are going to be deceitful to me, Achicha ani beramos, I will be your match when it comes to deceit.
He was deceitful before with the brachos.
That's a different story. Whether he was deceitful with the brachos or he was following his mother's instructions, that's a different story. Here, Yaakov says clearly, I will be deceitful. If that's what's required, I will be deceitful. Now, we have to recognize that that's not easy for Yaakov. That is tsar. And it's ongoing. The thing with the brachos from Yitzchak was a once-off event, and then it was over. And Yitzchak even acknowledged that the brachos went to the right person, so he was kind of endorsed. Whereas here, he's got years of this, where he's got to deal with this deceit, and then eventually at the end deceive his father in order to be paid out for what was really owing to him. So there's a lot of tsar going on in Yaakov's life in last week's parasha. The Medrash asks the question, how did Yaakov survive? What kept him going? What inspired Yaakov to keep going in spite of all of this tsar? He's got in the back of his mind, he's got the threat of his brother. He's got the issues of balancing his family, even now that he's worked it all out and he's married to Rachel and to Leah and to Bilhah and Zilpah for good measure. But he's still got to work it all out. I mean, we see the tension with Rachel and Leah around the flowers, and it's not so simple. And he's got Lavan,
and he's working crazy hours, and he's got to work on his own integrity, because in order to do what he has to do, he's got to be deceitful. So the Medrash asks, what kept Yaakov going through all of this? And the Medrash offers two opinions. One opinion is, and it's really interesting because both opinions are talking about something that Yaakov would only have had access to through prophecy. The one opinion is that Yaakov spent the entire time saying Tehillim. And that's what kept him going. The second opinion in the Medrash says it's not generically that Yaakov said Tehillim. There were specific Tehillim that Yaakov said, and those are the ones that kept him going. Which ones? The 15 chapters of Shir HaMailos. So Tehillim 120 to 134. The 15 chapters of Shir HaMailos. And the Medrash says something really interesting. That not the Medrash, commentaries on the Medrash say something really interesting, that if you calculate the lifespans of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, you will see that they all overlapped for 15 years. In other words, Yaakov was 15 when Avraham Avinu passed away. And so by saying the 15 Shir HaMailos, he was effectively calling up the schus, the merits of Avraham and Yitzchak to add to his own in order to have the koyach to see through this challenge of living with Lavan and all the various other pain that he was going through at the time. Okay? Which is quite a thought, right? But hang on, it gets better. So it's not simply that he wants to invoke the schus of Avraham and Yitzchak. Look at the content of these 15 chapters. Okay, we're going to talk about that in a second. Before we get to that, so what's the content of these 15 chapters of Tehillim? The truth is, you might find one or two that seem really apt for a person who's in distress. For example, right? When I'm in distress, where will my help come from? Ezri me'im Hashem, right? That Hashem never slumbers nor sleeps. Okay, fine, we can find some. But many of them don't really seem to have anything directly related to the context of difficulty. So what's common to all of these 15? Shir ha or la malois. That's what's common to all of them. Songs of, like they say in English, songs of ascent. What kept Yaakov going through all of this difficult period in his life is that he realized that tsar, pain, is, if it's used properly, is always a catalyst for elevation. Lefum tsara agra. That's what kept him going for 15 years, well, for 20 years of working with Lavan and having all the deceit and all the difficulties in his family. What kept him going? The realization that Hashem doesn't do things to us to cause tsar. So far we were talking about Lefum Tsara Agra as our choices. When we choose to do things that are difficult, then the reward for those things will be more valuable than the things we do or choose to do that are easy. But now we've got another layer to this. Lefum Tsara, if God forbid a person gives somebody difficulty in their life, the natural response to people is to collapse under difficulty, to feel attacked or to feel abused when they face difficulty. And Yaakov's template is Shir HaMailos, that the attitude that I'm supposed to have to tsar is Lefum Tsara Agra. If Hashem is putting me through something which is incredibly difficult, it has to be because afterwards Hashem is going to compensate with something that is incredibly meaningful. And that's what happens in Yaakov's story. He comes out on the other end with what? Incredible wealth, so much so that Lavan comes running after him and saying, this is all mine. And much more importantly, he comes out as the first of our forefathers to have a wholesome family. Because Avraham had a Yishmael who rebelled, and Yitzchak had an Esav who rebelled, whereas Yaakov has, as the Gemara describes it, mitasoi shlema, all of his offspring were whole. So, the Fum Tsara Agra, based on the pain, there is going to be reward afterwards. So there's a dual message over here from Ben Hey. Number one, if we do things that are uncomfortable for us, we get more value out of it. Number two, if Hashem sends things to us that are painful, we should never, God forbid, imagine that the pain is the objective. The objective is the value. Excuse me. The value and the greatness and the elevation that will come out of the pain. Now we can understand the shir part of it. Shir HaMailos. The fact that a person might have belief that difficult things will always afterwards, as the expression goes, yirida letzorech aliyah, that the purpose of a descent is only for ascent that will follow. But when you know this clearly and you really believe it and it's your guiding principle as it was for Yaakov, then not only do you anticipate good things, but shir, you're already in a state of simcha. You're already joyous before the reward. Even in the tsar, you already have shir, you already have song. That's the lesson the Midrash is telling us, that Yaakov shows us how to behave. Lefum tsara agra, therefore, because we know that Hashem will always compensate and in greater measure, therefore we can already experience the optimism and simcha in the now. And of course then it won't be so much tsar in anticipation.
The same with Joseph when he was sold, when he had to go through the process again of realizing that there might be a reason for his tsar when Joseph.
So it's interesting that you mention Yosef as an example, because when Yosef goes down into Mitzrayim as a slave, we don't get any real insight into his state of mind. When his family comes down, then we get a retrospective of his attitude, because when the family comes down, he says, don't be upset, right? Because Hashem sent me here in order to be this, that I'm going to be this great salvation for you. So we only get a retrospective, whereas with, according to the Midrash, with Yakov, we get a perspective, right, of how Yakov viewed the world. Now, in Yaakov's story, there's a great lesson about Lefum Tzara Agra as well. In fact, not only in Yaakov's story, we're going to see this in many places. I'll give you another example, maybe even a better example. Let's pause Yaakov's story for a moment and give you a better example. When Avraham has a bris, right? Now, what's unique about Avraham's bris is that we're told all of the forefathers and their families kept the Torah even before it was given. To the extent that, for example, when the angels come to Avraham, he's making matzah, right? And according to one opinion, Rashi even quotes it, that this is Pesach, and that's why they're making matzah. The question is, if Avraham keeps all the mitzvahs before they were given, why does he wait to have a bris? He knows, right? He knows that there is such a mitzvah in the same way as he intuitively knows everything else. In fact, the Gemara goes so far as to say that he even kept rabbinic mitzvahs like an eruv, but he doesn't have a bris, which is such a core mitzvah. It's the covenant between us and Hashem, eternal covenant. So why does he wait to have a bris? Because there's only one time you can have a bris. And he wants to have the power of a commandment as opposed to the value of a volunteer mitzvah. A volunteer mitzvah is great, but it's not as powerful as when Hashem tells you to do a mitzvah, so he waits. So he waits, and now because he's so old, and he's having a bris at 99 years old, you can imagine it's not a simple procedure, and it's not a simple recovery. So 3 days after his bris, what happens? What happens? What happens? Hashem comes. Before the angels. Hashem comes. Rashi tells us, why did Hashem come? Levaker es ha'choyle. He came to visit Avraham when he was sick, i.e. in pain. Why didn't Hashem come to heal him? Why did he come to visit him while he was sick? Why? Because Lefum Tzara Agra. If Hashem would arrive and miraculously heal the pain of the bris, simultaneously Hashem would have removed the value of the bris. The way Hashem has designed the world is that we're supposed to be citizens of this physical world. In this physical world, there are certain natural rules that Hashem made. And those natural rules include the fact that certain procedures are painful, in the same way as certain procedures are inconvenient, in the same way as certain procedures are expensive. Now, if you have a look at the whole cross-section of Judaism, it's pretty much how it works. Either it's inconvenient, or it's expensive, or it's painful. That's Judaism. Why is that? Because the goal of Judaism is not simply that I, as a neshama, who happens to be inhabiting a body right now, clocks up a whole lot of points so that one day when I return that neshama to Hashem, I can be welcomed appropriately and get rewarded appropriately. The goal is to actually make the physical world part of the holy journey, to connect the physical world to Hashem. If it doesn't feel physical, then it's not part of the journey. So if Avram has a bris, but then he doesn't have the experience that is the physical, normal experience of a person who's just had a surgery, then his physical body wouldn't be part of the journey to holiness. His neshama would be up there, but his body would be left behind. Lefum tsara agra doesn't just mean that if a person has a difficult time, then Hashem will compensate us with a great reward. It doesn't just mean that when there are difficult things in life, we can anticipate that afterwards Hashem will elevate us further. The tsara is an indication of the fact that we're impacting the real world. And now the real world is part of the so-called reward. What's the reward? To be connected to Hashem. That's the ultimate reward. So any time that we have to do something in our Judaism that feels uncomfortable, that feels inconvenient, that feels painful, that feels like it costs too much, that's only so that we can ensure that every part of the physical reality we live in is included in our connection to Hashem. That ultimately is the objective of Judaism.